If you look at your Bible, at the last 12 verses of the Gospel of Mark, you will probably find a footnote in it. Something to the effect that these verses are in dispute and were probably added later by some copyist. That's the typical kind of remark you see, annotating the last 12 verses of the Gospel of Mark. And the question is, were they added later? Or Westcott and Hort regards the last part of Mark, that's verses 9 through 20 of chapter 16, as a later addition. That this wasn't in the original, it was added by some well-intended copyist down the road a bit. Well, that's easily shredded because Irenaeus in 150 AD quotes it in his commentary. The Alexandrian codices were 4th century. But in the 1st and 2nd century, we have quotes from these so-called verses that were added later. No, they weren't added later. They were expurgated from the Alexandrian codices, is my contention. So Irenaeus either had a copy of the original, or he must have been clairvoyant. I don't think he was clairvoyant. Hippolytus, also in the 2nd century, quotes from these 12 verses. And these are several hundred years before the Alexandrian codices. So if these verses are not in the Alexandrian codices, they were expurgated. So you can attack this scholarship from the point of view of historical records, but I'm going to show you something even more surprising. If we studied the last 12 verses of Mark, we discover that verses 9 to 11 are an appearance to Mary, and it discusses the disciples' initial disbelief. From verse 11 to 18 are subsequent appearances, and then the conclusion of the chapter is verses 19 through 20. So from 9 to 20 is what we're talking about. Another way to organize those 12 verses is from verses 9 to 14 a simple narrative. Verses 15 to 18 is a discourse by Jesus Christ. And the last 2 verses are a conclusion of the whole gospel. And by the way, if you take these 12 verses away, you leave the gospels with the people confused and in disarray and in disbelief. You have no resurrection. So you can see why the Gnostics would love to drop those verses off. But anyway, these are the verses that are there. Let me share some things with you that Pannon discovered about these verses. The number of words in these 12 verses are 175. That's a multiple of 7 exactly. Oh, really? The vocabulary involved is 98 different words. That's a multiple of 7 exactly. The number of letters in the 12 verses are 553. That's a multiple of 7 exactly. The vowels are a multiple of 7 exactly. The consonants obviously would be a multiple of 7 exactly. The total vocabulary, I said, was 98 words. 84 of those are found earlier in the book of Mark. That's a multiple of 7 exactly. 14 of these words are found only here. It's a multiple of 7 exactly. 42 of those words are used in the Lord's address. 56 are not part of his were not part of his vocabulary that are in these 12 verses. All multiples of 7 exactly. Now, if I take just two rules, if I have one rule, you've got 6 chances of losing, 1 of winning, right? To meet 2 rules, it's 7 squared. In other words, I have 48 chances of losing and only 1 of having both rules of 7. You follow me? It goes by the square, right? 2 rules, it's the square. For 3 rules, it's the cube of that. 340. I'd have 343 chances of losing for every 1 of winning. And so it goes. For 4 rules, it's 2401. I've given you so far 9 rules. So you have 1 chance, if this is a random process, you have 1 chance in 40 million of coming out okay. You see how the more rules you add, the more restrictive it becomes. Would you like to try this, by the way? Now, assume you worked 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week for 50 weeks a year. That means you've got about 2,000 productive hours per year. And put those in minutes, that's 120,000 minutes per year. You've got 7 to 9 chances to try this randomly. 40 million attempts. Let's assume it takes you 10 minutes to do a draft. And if it doesn't work, it takes another 10 minutes to draw another draft. Well, then in that case, it would take you about 3,362 years. I said there were 175 words, 56 in the address of the Lord, 119 in the rest of the passage. In the introductory verses, it was 35. Each one of these is a multiple of 7 exactly. In other words, in the various groupings of the the natural divisions of the passage, you'll find it's always a multiple of 7 exactly. And it goes on and on. I won't badger this more than you need to here. There's something else you need to know about both Hebrew and Greek. They're distinctive in that each letter has a numerical value, and it is relevant that way. And here's a list of the Greek words. The alpha is worth 1, the beta 2, gamma 3, and so forth, right on through to the end. And the use of numerical values of letters is called gematria. There's a geometrical value. Every word thus has a numerical value. The numerical or geometrical value of this, the total geometrical value of the passage happens to be 106,663, which is a multiple of 7 exactly. Try doing that by accident. And if you take each one of these natural groupings, you'll discover each one has a geometrical value of a multiple of 7 exactly. The first word, the middle word, the last word, and so forth. And it goes on, as you can imagine here. I said we have a vocabulary of 98 words. 14 not before in Mark, 7 found later in the New Testament, 35 occurrences, and the numerical value of them, again, is a multiple of 7 exactly. The verse 20 of vocabulary is 14. It goes on and on in terms of words found here previously, words not found. Everything's a multiple of 7 exactly. The total forms is 133. The value of those are 89,663, which is a multiple of 7 exactly. Those that occur more once is 112, which is a multiple of 7. Occurring more than once is 21, a multiple of 7. Occurring 63 times, which itself is a multiple of 7. And we could go on and on like this. There's a word here that's an unusual word because it occurs nowhere else in the New Testament. It has a numerical value of 581, which is a multiple of 7 exactly. And it's preceded by 42 vocabulary words, and in the passage by 126. All these are multiples of 7 exactly. Now I've added a lot on here. We started out with just 9 rules. I've just given you 34 of them. What's the chance of these rules having happened by just random chance? Well, let's take a look at that. That's 7 to the 34th power, which is roughly 5 times 10 to the 28th tries would be needed. Now, you've already had enough experience with powers of 10 to realize these are big numbers. Let's assume you'd like to try to simulate this, and I'll let you have a computer to help you. Okay? There are about 3 times 10 to the 7th seconds per year. And I'm going to give you a computer that can do 400 million tries per second. Okay, that's a pretty good machine. And that means it would take about 4 times 10 to the 8th tries per second. It would take about 4.3 million computer years. Or putting it another way, I would need 1 million supercomputers working 4.3 million years to obtain this result by randomness. So this is again, and by the way, I've just used 34 conditions here. Pannon identified 75 of them. So you can say some of those are not independent of each other. That's true. So 2 or 3 of those actually derive one from the other. Okay, throw those out. I got 75 to pick from. The New Testament, let me show you some other things that Pannon discovered. The New Testament consists of 27 books, right? That means there's an opening and closing word to each of the 27 books. It begins and ends with a word, right? So 2 times 27, that means there's 54 words, right? Among those 54 words, there's a total vocabulary of 28 words that are a multiple of 7 exactly. In the Gospels alone, there's a multiple of 7 exactly. The total geometrical value of those words is also a multiple of 7 exactly. The value of the shortest word, which is 1 letter, is 70, and it's a multiple of 7, obviously. The value of the longest word is a multiple of 7, and this one's particularly interesting. The longest word happens to be apocalypsis, and it happens to be 7 times 6 times 6 times 6. That's kind of interesting, I think. This is the one I love. I realize we're hitting a lot of these things. It may be overkill here. But I want to show you the one that blows me away completely. We've discovered the vocabulary in the Greek that's unique to Matthew. Now understand what I'm talking about. The vocabulary is unique. These are words that only Matthew uses. If you go through the whole Bible, take all the words, There are 42, there's a vocabulary that's unique to Matthew. It occurs only 42 times. It's a multiple of 7 exactly. And those have 126 letters, a multiple of 7 exactly. Now, what makes this particularly peculiar is, let's assume for discussion that Matthew tried to do this on purpose. How would you do that? If you were Matthew and you decided you would like to have this characteristic in your gospel, how would you go about making sure that the words that you alone use is a multiple of 7 exactly? Well, you can only do it 2 ways. You've got to sit down with all the other writers of the New Testament, assuming you can figure out who they're going to be, and get them to agree not to use your little list of words. How many think that happened? Not very likely. Or you could argue that this feature is an argument that Matthew wrote last. Because in theory, at least, he could lay down everybody else's writings and make sure that it fit. So you could use this as an argument that Matthew wrote his gospel last. He either had prior agreement, that doesn't make sense, or his gospel was written last. Okay, so these unique, the Gospel of Matthew has a vocabulary unique to itself that's a multiple of 7 exactly. So does Mark. Well, I thought Matthew wrote last. No, Mark wrote last, because Mark also has a vocabulary unique to him that's a multiple of 7 exactly. But so does Luke. And so does John. They each were written last. And obviously I'm being facetious. And so did James, Peter, Jude, and Paul. Each one was written last. In other words, each one has a vocabulary that nobody else uses that happens to be an exact multiple of 7. There's only one explanation for this that I can tolerate mathematically, and that is that the Holy Spirit was an overseer of every word, every letter in the New Testament. I think that's exciting.